is Gemara Moed Katan Daf Chaf, and we'd like to sponsor today's shir as a schosi the neshama for Yaakov Nachum ben Rav Pesach Zelig, a yid that learned the daf together with us up until last week. Emir Hashem, his neshama should be able to a higher and higher place in Gan Eden Shalmaila, and the entire Katz family from Yushalayim should have an incredible nechama over their loss, as well as learning Shvius Chashidach V'Yilchaim in the version Mir Rav Yitzchak Kedusha Lezer B'Shan Merkel Ler Merchav Zavashin Tasikuv Zavashin Tashima Ben Chaya Ofek Ben Tali Shalom Ben Levi Zava Rachel Bas Adina, as well as Chashvi Rosh Hashem Shalom Zen Vei Ben Vei Chaim B'Sar Shalom Zin Vei Zayit Asar Bas Kananti Tavasim As Chayz Zayit Shalom Endel Lezer Vert Shalei Hashem As Tamim V'Sharvik V'Shechana Shmo Ben Til Din Chan Reizum Chaim As Yina Din Endeshin Din Osvi Vei Gerdor Rivka V'Shem Tavsim Ben Chlas Amr Ben Yakot Sar Bas Kila Shalom Yisachar Ben Esther Yehudis Or Avram Ben Rachel Adai Shimon Ben Chana Rav Yigal Perel Bas Esther Miriam Gabriela Bas Lumi Yisrael Yitzchak Ben Dina V'Saych Shar Chali Yisrael. We're holding at the bottom of your Testament B's. We started the question that started 5 lines from the bottom. Abaya's Shaila to Rab, or Rava, Kavrei beregel regel oila minyan shleishim rein oila minyan shleishim. We're in the middle of the discussion how Yontif relates to Avelos, whether it cancels it, whether it's pushed off, etc. So Rabbi had a fundamental Shaila that if someone is nifter and the burial happens on Yontif, do the days of Yontif count for shleishim? And the Gemara explained for Shiva, for sure they do not count. Why for sure they do not count? There was a Rashi we did not see. Rashi, 6 lines on the bottom of this Amud Beis, teaches us that the reason it does not count is because there's no Isser wearing shoes, and and we're not minhag to turn over the beds on Yontif. The question is, but on Shleishim, which is general in Isser haircuts and shaving, which there does apply to Yontif, does that get pushed off or not? Or do the days of Yontif count for the Shleishim? So Rava responded 3 lines on the bottom, Amar lei einoi oila, that was Rava's answer. So Eisvei, but asks us the Gemara and Rabbah. Hakover has me such a yom kodem regel, meine chamishi yom acher regel, u'melachto nasle de acher. Case number 1. Let's get this clear. We're gonna have a brisa with a reisha and a seifa. Eventually, this is gonna try to be a kasha on Rabbah's answer that Yontif does not count for the days of Shleishim. So says the Raisa, if someone buries his days 2 days before regel, 2 days which we know means that regel does not cancel it. So what happens? You have 5 days after Yontif. And now what happens? Nasis mul al yidei, umalachde nasi de'acher. Other people do your work. V'avadu v'shevchasav oisim b'tzina. And they'll have to work for you in private, but take place in your house. Ve'in rabim is asking me mai. That's a very important word. And the public do not deal with you. What does that mean? Says Rashi, koloimar. Ein shrichel l'nacham ha'achar regel. There's no nicham avilim after Yontif. So there's an interesting thing that's happening here. After Yontif, you have to finish your 5 days of avilus. You had 2 before Yontif, now 5 after. But says the Gemara on Yontif itself, Shekvar Nichamo Shiva Yadim Regel, their Nechama, the Avelus was on Yontif. And therefore, after Yontif, you have 5 more days of quote unquote Shiva, but no one comes to visit because they already finished their 7 days. As we turn over to today's Daf of Daf Chaf and Aleph, the Gemara says, like we just said, Shekvar Nizasku by Beregel, because they already dealt with it on Regel, meaning they already had the 7 days of comfort. So the Brisa speaks out the rule. All the practices of Avelos, Regel Mafsikai, the Yontif stops for the personal of the mourner himself. He himself, again, does not lie on the floor, doesn't flip over his bed, etc. But whatever is the public matter, as Rashi says, that they come and visit, ain't Regel Mavsiko, that's done on Yontif itself. Case number 1, death 2 days before Yontif, 2 days of Shiva before Yontif, 5 days of Shiva after Yontif, but the Nechama, the visiting of the Avelus, is on Yontif itself. Case number 2 of the Brisa, Kavru Shloisha Yamim, let's say they buried the dead 3 days b'Seifa Regel, the last 3 days on Yontif itself. Now, Mayna Shiva Achar Regel, you have 7 days, because you know Avelus before Yontif or on Yontif, you have all 7 days after Yontif, but of those 7 days, Arba Yamim Arishainim Rabim is asking, by the first 4 days, the people deal with you. Why only 4? Because 3 of them they did on Yontif. As we saw already, Nicham Avelim happens on Yontif. Shleishim Achrayim Rabim is asking, by the last 3 days, they do not deal with, because they already did it on Yontif. So Arbiyam Rishayim, they deal with not the last 3. Why? Shekvarnis Asku Beregel. And now the Brisa throws in one last line. Viregel Oileloi. and the Yontif counts for him. Now, what does this last line mean? That the Regel Oilaloi, that the Yontif counts for part of the Shleishim. Says the Gemara, my lava seifa. We seemingly think it's going the second case. What was the second case when the death happened on Yontif? It's Kasha and Rabbah. Rabbah said when someone dies on Yontif, does Yontif count as Shleishim? The answer was no, said Rabbah. We see here that Regel does count, and if it's going in the safe on the case when the death happened on Yontif, we see that there is Yontif counting. Answers the Gemara, Lo Yarisha is going in the first case when it was before Yontif, and therefore there is no question on Rabbah. Eisvei, the Gemara has a second question on Rabbah. Regel Oila Minian Shleishim, says the Braisa, Yontif counts. Kate said, what's the case? Cover b'tchilas regel. If they buried the person in the beginning of the Regel, Regel, they have 7 full days after. And the servants work in privacy. Rab is asking, boy, why? Because they already did it on Yontif. Another Brisa says explicitly in the case when the death happened on Yontif, and that is indeed a question or refutation of the opinion of Rabbah. Says the Gemara. Now a few more stories that have to deal with the death happening on Yontif with regard to the Shleishim. Ki asa Rabin Amar Rav Yechon, and Rabin came to Bavel, he said to Rav Yechanan, Afilu cover b'regel. Even if the kavura, the burial, was on Yontif itself, the Yontif is included in the Shleishim, like we just saw. V'chein oireli Rav Elazar Rav Elazar taught Rav Padas the same berei son. Afilu kiver b'regel. So Tanu Rabbanan begins the Gemara. A new topic, the topic that we started with yesterday, that if the death and the Kvura was 3 days before Yontif, that's when Yontif cancels the rest of it. Says the Gemara, Tanu Rabbanan. We're about 15 lines down. Chafam and Aleph, first word on the line is Beregel. Tanu Rabbanan. Kiyem Kfiyas Amita Shleisha Yanim Kaidim Regel. If they flipped over their beds, meaning they started Avilus, the Shiva 3 days before Yontif, Ein Yitzarch L'chleis Acharegel, Rav Eliezer, like we learned, you don't have to do anything else after Yontif. Why not? Because you already did 3 days before, and then Yontif cancels the rest. Even 1 day, even 1 moment, and I'm sure many people who know the halacha were wondering yesterday, what's this 3-day business? We know, unfortunately, in many cases, 1 moment before Yontif, the Avila managed to sit down, and that's it, there's no more Shiva. That's the Shita of the Chacham. Even 1 moment, or 1 hour, literally. Although, if you look it up in halacha over here in Shin Tzadi Tes in Yeridea, it's the Shach that points out that Shach just means any amount of time. So that's the sheet of the Chacham. And now let's see what's the Psak halacha. Says the Gemara. Amar Rav Elazar Rav Shimon, says Rav Elazar name Rav Shimon. Hey, need to be Beis Shammai. Hey, need to be Beisil. What? Shebisham ayoyimim shleisha yamim. Beisil afilu yom echad. That's Beisil. Amar Avuna, Amar Rav Chiya bar Rabba, Amar Rav Yechon, Amar Rav Yechon, Rav Chiya bar Rabba, Ul Rav Avuna. Afilu yom echad v'yisha achas. Okay, so we're seeing this is the opinion of Beisil. This is the sheet of the Chachamim. And now we're seeing other opinions that are all the same. But Rava Amar, halacha kitana didan damar shleisha. Says Rava, no. It might be the Chachamim, it might be Beisil, but it's not the Psak halacha, says Rava. We go with our Mishnah, 3 days. But says the Gemara, let's not stop in the middle. Ravina ikla letzur de bras. Ravina went to visit. Amarli Rav Chaviva Ravina. Rav Chaviva said to Ravina, "Hilchos Samai, what's halacha?" Amarlei afilu yom echad, afilu sha'achas, and that is indeed the halacha that if Avilus begins for 1 moment, if the Avila managed to sit down, sometimes they'll even sit in the Beis HaKvaros in the cemetery. If they sit on the ground and they start the Nicham Avil and they start the Shiva, Yontif comes along and Yontif cancels the rest of it. But now, we've been speaking about Avilos, we've been speaking about Shiva. Says the Gemara, finally, what's the source? What's the Makar? 5 lines on the wide lines. What is the source that there is Shiva? Where do we know Shiva from? Yosef Rav Chiya bar Rabba, Rav Ami, Rav Yitzchak Nafcha, Kilid, Rav Yitzchak ben Elazar, nothing Milsa b'Minayu, and the following statement emerged from amongst these great Gedalim. Minayin la'Avil Shiva d'chsev Afachti chagecha ma'avel. I'm going to turn over. What am I going to turn over? The festivals into mourning a pasuk in Amos. Ma chag, just like Yontiv is Shiva, 7 days of Avilus. Shiva says the Gemara, clear proof. Avilus is 7 days. Vema teres the Chad Yomi says, Gemara, 1 second. There are Yom Tovim that are 1 day, Shavuos. And says the Gemara, no, Humi Bailich Reish Lakish on the first white line. We need to know that for Reish Lakish, meaning what? Amar Reish Lakish Rishon Rav Yudin Isiyah. Minayel Shmuel Rechaika Shinu Eges El Yom Echad. How do we know a Shmuel Rechaika? What's a Shmuel Rechaika? The Gemara is going to explain. Back in the world without technology and without communication, you would find out sometimes that someone was nifter and it happened 35 days ago. It happened a long time ago. A Shmuel Rechaika. So what happens when someone finds out Rachmana Litzlan, his brother, his mother's father, were nifter a long time ago? What's the halacha? So says Rish Lakish B'Shum Rav Yudan Nisiyah. How do we know in that case Avil is only 1 day? The pasuk says we made your chag into Avel. And what's chag? And there is a chag of 1 day. So the Gemara is answering that it's true. Chag can mean 7 and chag can mean 1. And we have 2 different dinim, and that's what we need to know. In a normal case, it's going to be 7, but in the case of a shmur rechaika that we're about to discuss at length, then it's only going to be 1 day. Tanu Rabbanan, delving deeper into that topic, 3 lines down. Shmuel Karaiva Noyag Shiva. Shmuel Karaiva, as we're going to define in a moment, that if you hear soon after the proximity of the death, within 30 days, the halacha is the family members have to mourn Noyag Shiva 7 Ushleishim. Shmuel Rechaika Noyag Yom Echad. Veizi Karaiva Veizi Rechaika, like we've been discussing. What do these words mean? Says the Gemara, Karaiva is V'say Shleishim Rechaika is Achar Shleishim Divi Rabbi Akiva. If you hear about it within 30 or outside of 30, that is Karaiva or Rechaika. V'chachamim Aimrim Achar Shmuel Karaiva V'achar Shmuel Rechaika. No, Yeheges, Shiva, Ushleishim, says the Chacham, we disagree. There's nothing to do with when you hear about it. The Avilus is always 7 followed by 30. And Amar Rabbi Rachana, what's the halacha? Amar Rabbi Yechon, Kol Makom Shatamoti Yachad, Mikol v'Rabbi Machmirim. Over here, the Rabbi and the Chacham are being Machmir, because they're saying that the Avilus is always 7 and 30, even if you find out over 30 days from the death. Halacha ke Rabbi Chutz Mizu. Why? We know already why. Shaval Bishav Kiva make of a chamachmir halachi Rav Kiva. Why? Another one of the rules. Another application that we paskin like the lenient opinion. We saw this already back at Daf Yomi in the rules of Avelus. And now we go into some stories proving that which we just said. Rav Chanina Atzilei Shmo Da'avu. Rav Chanina heard that his father was nifter mebei Chozai from Beit Chozai. Asli kamed Rav Chisda, came to Rav Chisda. Amrlei Shmo Rechaika Nagas El Yom Echad. It was more than 30 days. Rav Chanina, excuse me, you only have 1 day of Avelus. Rav Nasim Arami Atzilei Shmo Di'imei mebei Chozai. He heard a Shmo about his mother. He asked Rava, Amarle, Hare Amru Shmo Rechaika Noeges El Yom Echad Belvad. Again, only 1 day of Avelus. Esvei, but 1 second, asked the Gemara, when do we say that there's only 1 day of Avelus if it's a Shmo Rechaika? You hear about it after 30 days. Says the Braisa, that's only by the Chamishe Meisei Mitzvah, the 5 relatives that you have a Chi of a mitzvah to mourn. A father and mother, different rules. Shiva ushleishim. So says the Gemara, so why in the previous 2 stories was it a case of father and mother? Why in those stories did we say that you only hold 1 day? Amarle yechidahi. That brisa is a das yochid v'lo like I was saying, we do not hold of that. Rather, we hold like Rabbi Akiva that whether it is father or mother, or whether it's other relatives, it's only going to be 1 day of Avelus. Tanya, as we learned in a Raisa, Maisa, 4 lines to the bottom of Chafam and Aleph, Maisa, Meis, Avishal, Rav Tzadik, Beginezek. The father of Tzadik was Nifter, Ginezek, Vodiyu, Lachar, Shleishim, Shalish, Shanim. And he only found out after 3 years. Ubav, Shalis, Elisha ben Avuya, and he heard Elisha ben Avuya of Navi fame, who's a Kenim, Shimai, and this Kenim that were with him. V'amru, no, Shiva, Ushleishim. Kshemeis ben Aisha, V'chia, Begaila. And another story when the son of Ravachia was nifter in Galus, Yashav Alav Shiva Shleishmi as well, did 7 and 30. Asks the Gemara, you just told me that he did 7 and 30. Amy, is that true? But Ravachia, the same Ravachia, when Rav went for Babel to Eretz Yisrael, and that's where Ravachia was living. So Ravachia asked Rav, is my father still alive? As we turn over to Chaf Amid Beis. Amar Le, Rav responds, Ema. Rav says, Ema kayemes. Rav says, is your mother alive? Interesting. So Amar Le, Rav Chi responds, Ema kayemes. Okay, so tell me, is my mother alive? Amar Le, Abba kayem. Rav said back, is your father alive? Amar Le l'shameis Rav Chi achat. What happened over here? Rav Chi understood that both. Not it's true. It's true that the father and mother are alive, but he understood that. I made a mistake over here. It's there's a little bit of a family going on over here. That Rav Chia asked to Rav, is your mother alive? And Rav responded, is my father alive? So based off of that, Rav Chia understood that these two people, his brother and sister, which if you look at Rashi in the second line, Rashi said, Rav Chia v'imach achaisi kayemesi. So he understood that they were both nifter. So Chalitz Leiman Ali, Rav Chia told his attendant, take off my shoes, and carry my clothing to the base of Merchatz. Now, how exactly why do you go to the base of Merchatz? He's an oval. Shema Mina says the Gemara based on the story of Rav Chia Tlas. Shema Mina, you can't wear shoes. Shema Mina, Shmua Rechaika, because he heard about it is more than 30 days. I guess. Ella yoim echad ushma mina mixes hayoim kikulai, and therefore once he was naig avilos for one moment, you have mixes hayoim. Boom, says Rav Chia. Now he can go to the bathhouse to prove to everyone that is indeed the halacha. Once you do part of your avilos, the rest of the avilos is no longer, and it's a shmua rechaika, so it's only one day, and that is the opinion of Rav Chia. So this was a long question because in Amud Aleph we said that Rav Chia holds always 7 and 30. Answers the Gemara, Rabbi Chia lechod, Rabbi Achia lechod, Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Achia, two different people. Therefore, do not ask questions one unto the other. It continues the Gemara 8 lines down. Amar Rav Yossi bar Avin Shamashma Karaiva Biregel. On Yantiv, you heard that a relative was nifter. Ulumoitzaya Regel Nas is Rechaika. And after Yantiv, what happens? It's now 30 days. What do you do now? Again, you heard about on Yantiv, the first day of Yantiv, 25 days ago. Rahman al-Tzan, a brother, sister, father, mother were nifter. So it's Yontif right now. 7 days later after Yontif ends, now it's 32 days, for example. Now it's a Shmua Rechaika. So how do we deal with this? On one hand, you heard about it when it was Kraiva, you heard about it within 30 days, but you're not able to do anything about Avilus until it's more than 30 days. Says the Raisa, the Yontif is including the 30 days. It's called a Shmua Rechaika, and therefore there's only one day of Avelus. And similarly, Tani Rav Adod min Kisri Kamid Rav Yechanan Shama Shmua Karaiva b'Shabbos Ulemoitzai Shabbos Nasir Rechaika Mamish on that 29th, 30th day. Then Einay Nagal Yom Echad. Why? Because it becomes a Shmua Rechaika, and that's the end of the topic of Shmua Kraiva, Shmua Rechaika. Again, the concept being, if you heard about it within 30 days, it's Kraiva. Outside of 30 days, it's Rechaika. The Machlaik is if there makes a difference. Do we see that on a Kraiva when you hear within 30 days, you're 7 and 30? If it's outside of 30 days, it's always 1, or do we say it's always 7 and 30? And finally, we just concluded that on Yontif, how do we consider Yontif with regard to the Shmua? And the Gemara says it counts, and therefore it will create a Shmua Karaiva of 25 days, for example, into Rechaika, and therefore there will only be Avelos for 1 day. Now continues the Gemara within this interesting concept, which of course was probably very prevalent in a world without technology when news travels very slowly. Continue this. The discussion of Shmuais. Ask the Gemara, Kaireya or Einoi Kaireya? In the case of a Shmua Rechaika, do you tear Kriya or not? Rav Mani Amar Einoi Kaireya, Rav Chanina Amar Kaireya. You do indeed tear. Amar Rav Mani Rav Chanina. So Rav Mani asked Rav Chanina, who said that you tear Kriya. You know why you don't tear Kriya? Because there is no Shiva. However, you hold that there is Kriya. The Amri Kaireya, you Rav Mani. You Rav Chanina hold that you do tear Kriya even though the death happened more than 30 days ago. Kriya b'loy Shiva mi'ika. Is there ever a concept of Kriya tearing your clothing without Shiva? Because in this case it's been more than 30 days, the whole Shiva is only 1 day, there's no full 7 days. So is there ever an entity, a concept, a time that you could have Kriya without a full Shiva? And on this explains the Gemara back, yeah, indeed, there are such times. Is it so shver? Easy Abu Rav Zira, Vamila Achud Rav Zira, Kamed Rav Zira, Misha in Lachaluk Likrayav and Nizam Libisach Shiva. What happens at the time of the death? You don't have a shirt to tear, and then what happens? You get a shirt during Shiva Kairea, you tear it right then. La'achar Shiva Eina Kairea. So what do we see? We see very clearly that there is an element of Kriya without Shiva, because you're tearing your shirt in the middle of the 7 days. So Ani Rav Zira Basrei, Rav Zira responded, Bamedvar Ma'amurim, B'chamishi Meisa Mitzvah. That's only the 5 relatives. You're always going to tear Kriya even after the Shiva is over. So what do you see from Rav Zira? We see from Zera that there is a concept of Kriya even after Shiva. And you were just suggesting when Rav Chanina asked, when whom asked who? We lost the place over here. When Rav Chanina, one second, just trying to find the question. Rav Mani and Rav Chanina. So when Rav Mani asked Rav Chanina, says the Gemara, your response was, is there ever an entity of Kriya without Shiva? And the answer is yes. But explains the Gemara, it's not a raya, because that's a special din for the father and the mother, a special kavod. That is the reason why there'll be a din of Kriya even without Shiva, but generally, Kriya tearing the clothing and Shiva are indeed linked together. Says the Gemara, Tanu Rabbanan, Kol Amar B'Parshas Kohanim Shekoin Mitam Lahen. Any of the cases that the Kohen has to become Mitame, Aval Misavel Aleim, there's a din of Avelus. Velu Hein, Ishto, a wife, Aviv, a father, Ima, a mother, Achav, a brother, Achois, a sister, Benaya, a son, Bito, a daughter, Hoitziva Aleim, they added on, Achiv, Achois, Absula, the brother or sister who was never married, who never had relations, Me'imai, even though they're only step brother and sisters from the mother, still you have to say Shiva. Nisua ben Ima, and a sister that's married, whether it's from the mother or the father or the mother, whether it's a paternal or maternal mother, whichever way of the half sister, you still have to sit Shiva. And now continues the Braisu Kishem Shemizavel Aleihem. Kach misavel al shniyim. You give avelus for them and on their shniyim, their secondary relations shalem of them. Divrei Rabbi Akiva, Rav Shimon Elazar, Einam misavel ella al ben benoiv al aviv. We only say shiva on grandsons and grandparents. That's the second tier. That's the shniyim. That Rav Shimon Elazar agrees there is an element of shiva, not in all secondary tiers, but only grandfather and grandson. Which of course is what we do. Kosh misavel Allah misavel imai. That says the Chachamim, anyone who is misavel, you mourn together with him. Says the Gemara, what exactly does that mean? Chachamim ainu ta'anekama. Seemingly, the Chachamim are just reiterating that whoever has mourning, you do the same thing with him. Ikebenayo imai. When you're in the house of someone sitting Shiva, ki Adam Rav Lei Rav Chia Berei Amar Lei Rav Lechia Berei Rav told Chia his son V'chein Amar Lei Rav Huna Le Rav Berei Ba'apa no you got velus in front of your wife and she's in Avel, you have to know you got velus. But when you're not in front of her, a level of being bishtatev, a level of feeling the pain onto yourself. But says the Gemara, Mar Ukva Shachav Lei, a story, Mar Ukva Shachav Le Bar Chamua, the Marukah's father-in-law was the son of Marukah's father-in-law, was Nifter. He thought he has to do Shiva and Shleishim. All Ravuna Ligabei comes in Ravuna and he says, Ashkechei found him Amalei. So Dinaisa Bais Lamechal. Do you want to eat a meal of a mourner? And he responded, Loi. Amru lechvayid ishtay ela chame v'chamayse. They did not say that you have to mourn for the wife, only the honor for the father-in-law and for the mother-in-law, meaning you're not really an aval, but you're just in a level of avilus for lechvayid chame v'chamayse. Tani learned in a brayse misha meis chame v'chamayse. Ein a rashi look of Israel as chazis pesekes. We've seen this in the past. Someone whose father or mother was nifter, so they are not allowed to force their spouse, which is their father-in-law or mother-in-law, to put on makeup, etc. What do we do? Rather, they have to deal with avilus together. Similarly, when she is in that state, she's not allowed to put on makeup. That is Bryson number 1. So says the Gemara, we have another Raisa. It sounds familiar. Even though you can't force your wife to put on makeup, but you're allowed to pour her, she's allowed to pour him a cup, she's allowed to make his bed, and she's allowed to wash his hands in his face. So says the Gemara, these two Raisas are direct contradictions. The first Raisa says that the husband doesn't din about velos together with his wife, and the second brisa says absolutely not. That when it's chamul chamaisa, then out of their kavod, the husband has to feel the morning together with his wife, but with other relatives, then the husband does not have any level of avelos. Tanami hachi, a raya to these 4 lines of the bottom. Only the father-in-law, mother-in-law, and that is the cases which you're going to have avelos due to the wife in order to give the in-laws the proper kavod. We'll pick it up from a Meimar the next year in Mirza Hashem.